Hi, I'm James Gardner, host of Your History, Your Story, a podcast for everybody who loves stories about interesting people and events told by those who uncovered them from within their own family trees. This, we hope, will inspire you to discover and celebrate your history and your story. In honor of Grover Cleveland Week, March 13th through 19th, 2022, Your History, Your Story will be speaking with Troy Senik, author of A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Troy will be giving us a sneak peek into his new book, due to be released this fall. In addition to being an author, Troy is a businessman, journalist, and was a presidential speechwriter at the White House during the second term of President George W. Bush. As we celebrate Grover Cleveland Week and President Cleveland's 185th birthday, Troy will tell us why he chose to write about Cleveland and how he believes his new book will provide a fresh, new perspective of our nation's 22nd and 24th president. I'd now like to welcome Troy Senik to our show. Welcome, Troy.
Thank you, James. Delighted to be here.
I've been doing a little bit of investigation on you. Hope you don't mind. I've been stalking you on the internet. No, I'm just kidding. In addition to being an author, you're a businessman, podcaster, journalist, and you were also a speechwriter in the White House. Tell us a little bit about your background and how did you become a presidential speechwriter?
Well, I had this sort of strange trajectory, which is that I started out as a kid who was interested in history, and then that translated into an interest in politics. And then I sort of found my way back into history now with this book. I became a White House speechwriter at the age of 24, which is pretty young. I don't know if I'm the youngest ever, but I'm probably pretty close. And people, when they hear that story, sort of assume that I either came out of an elite university or that I was the child of somebody who was influential politically or financially. And I was neither one of those things. I had a sort of aggressively middle-class upbringing in a not particularly glamorous part of California. And it just happened that while I was in graduate school, I had a professor who himself had been a former White House staffer who took a shine to my writing and forwarded it without ever telling me to the guy who was the chief speechwriter at the time. This was in the second term of George W. Bush's administration. It was really phenomenal. I mean, it's more than anybody could ever have hoped for if that was your aspiration, to be a presidential speechwriter, which was mine. And then about a year after that, a spot opened up, and the gentleman he had forwarded to, Bill McGurn, who's now at the Wall Street Journal, wrote to me. I, at the time, had a good but not particularly distinguished editorial job at a newspaper in LA, and he just sent me an email and said, "Write me 3 sample speeches. Here are your prompts. Go." And about 6 weeks after that, I was walking into the West Wing of the White House, scared as could be.
Oh boy!
And yeah, so I did. I was there for the remainder of the Bush administration. So I came in late 2007 and was there until early 2009. And in a weird way, because that was actually the job that I would have wanted in politics and government, it was the last one I ever had. I didn't stay in Washington after that, which people told me to. Partially because I sort of discovered that I'm more interested in ideas and history, and I'm not an especially partisan person either. I didn't really want to stay in DC. And so, I left after that. And since then, all of my involvement has been, as you said, in journalism or think tanks and focused more on ideas, than on politics.
Well, you certainly had some exposure to the president by writing speeches, and you were right there in the middle of everything, but you had this love of history, and you've also had a journalistic career as well, and they've sort of all come together. So you've got this book now that's coming out in the fall, and the name of the book is A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. Do you actually have a release date on that yet, Troy?
I believe the current release date is September 20th. I put a slight asterisk next to that just because, like a lot of authors, the supply chain issues have led to a lot of these dates being moved around. But I think this is the final one.
Got it. Let me ask you this. Why did you choose Grover Cleveland to write about?
This may not surprise you, but you were not the first person to ask me the question, why Grover Cleveland? Usually it's more incredulous than the way that you phrased it. For a few reasons. I mean, I'll just start with the sort of brass tacks one, which is when you actually look at the history of the American presidency, there are only 14 out of the 45 presidents who've served 8 years or longer in the case of Franklin Roosevelt. And if you were to look at that list, almost all of them are the presidents that we regard as household names, with maybe one or two exceptions. James Monroe, maybe not so much, but people at least know the Monroe Doctrine. Grover Cleveland is sort of the biggest exception. And I've always found it strange that there has not been more written about him. I mean, the best book that came out about Cleveland came out, won a Pulitzer Prize, but it came out almost 100 years ago. And there have been books written since, many of which are kind of retreads of that book. And to some degree, all of our books are retreads of that book because it had so many of the contemporary sources. That's point one. Point two, I think Cleveland is such a fascinating figure because he has a rise, a political rise that feels in some ways distinctly modern, in that I think people would be surprised to learn that a figure from the late 19th century moved through the political hierarchy as quickly as he did. So you can look at Grover Cleveland in 1881. He's 44 years old at that point. And he is a respected but not particularly well-known lawyer in Buffalo, New York. The only office he had ever held prior to that was as the sheriff of Erie County, where Buffalo is located. That was about a decade prior to this point in his life. Mm-hmm. If you draw a line forward from 1881, in the course of the next 3 years, he becomes mayor of Buffalo, governor of New York, president of the United States. It's this incredible ascent. And it's an ascent that is fueled mostly by his reputation for integrity, by the fact that at a time when state and local and federal politics were all dominated by a lot of self-dealing and a lot of insiderism, Grover Cleveland really sort of defined himself in opposition to that, and defined himself in opposition to that on a sort of a bipartisan basis. I mean, he was a Democrat. He was the first Democrat who had been elected president since 1856. So there's this huge gap, after the Civil War. So obviously he disapproved of sort of Republican self-dealing, didn't care much for Democratic self-dealing either, which as his political career went on, ended up being the source of some real hardships. It led to a lot of fighting within the Democratic Party. But I thought the rise was remarkable. I thought the lack of, historical coverage of him, as I said, was lamentable. The other thing that I think is valuable about looking at Grover Cleveland is because there is such a deep sense of principle at work. I think his career is a rebuke to political cynicism. And I think that's why the story of Grover Cleveland is interesting, even if you don't see the world the way that he did. I mean, the way he saw the world was sort of through the lens of what we might call classical liberalism. It's a political philosophy that is becoming more and more homeless. For a while, it sort of had more of a home in the Republican Party, but that's certainly diminishing now, at least in percentage terms. As with all historical figures, there's a danger in trying to analogize him to today's politics. Mm-hmm. He's a constitutionalist, but even if you don't see the world the way that he did, there's something really quite beautiful about the story about a guy whose hallmark was integrity and was courage and was doing the kinds of things that we always say we want our politicians to do, right? Making the tough decisions, not necessarily following public opinion when he thinks it's trending in the wrong direction, and making enemies, but making enemies on principle, because he thought he was doing the right thing. It's not to say he always was doing the right thing, but the fact that he was animated by that sense of integrity, which I think is a thing that people increasingly feel like is missing from American politics, I think makes him a very interesting case study.
Troy, did you find it very challenging to do research on President Cleveland?
It was more difficult than it would have been under other circumstances because I started writing this book late in 2019. So COVID hit pretty early into it. I was able to get to Buffalo, where he lived for much of his adult life before he became governor. And then after governor and presidency, he never really went back. I was able to go to Buffalo before the pandemic hit. But almost everything else had to be done remotely. And I was very fortunate. The people at the Library of Congress were very helpful. In fact, they had digitized a lot of the Cleveland records right at the start of COVID, which was really helpful because it probably would have cost me another, I don't know, 18 months or 2 years in putting the book together had I not had access to that. And then there were some other difficulties, one of which is that Grover Cleveland, by his own admission, was pretty careless with his papers. They're not actually organized all that well. And they're a little intimidating when you do get to them because, you know, you see Grover Cleveland, he's an enormous man, right? I mean, it's a huge, sort of imposing figure, not tall, but, you know, large. And you would never imagine, if you just see a photograph of this guy, that he has this sort of dainty, sort of schoolgirl type script that he wrote in. So it's actually very hard to read a lot of what he wrote. But the good thing about what he did write, as I mentioned earlier, he was a lawyer before he went into politics. And he was a very scrupulous, detail-oriented lawyer. So if you read the accounts of him when he was a lawyer, one of the things that you hear repeatedly, this wasn't a guy who wowed people with theatrics in the courtroom, but it was a guy who studied his brief so thoroughly that he could never be bested. He just knew the ins and outs of everything. The reason I bring that up relative to the research is when you do get to the stuff that is in his hand, even when he was president, he has detailed it so thoroughly that to a modern eye, it is not recognizable as the writing of a president. It feels like the writing of a staffer because you have just got so much detail. And one of the things I wanted to do with this book that a lot of other Cleveland books, I think, don't do is take him seriously as a policymaker. There's a weird thing about Grover Cleveland, which is that a lot of write-ups of him tend to emphasize him being sort of slightly boring. And then they proceed to write almost entirely about his personality and his personal life. There's a weird duality. And that comes oftentimes at the expense of understanding the issues that actually dominated his presidency. 8 years is a long time. And so this book really takes the policymaking side seriously, really asks the reader to think about what were the things he was dealing with over those 8 years, and is made much easier by dint of the fact that he chronicled it so thoroughly, dryly sometimes, but thoroughly.
They were good for helping sleep issues, right? Is that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Wow. Yeah, I was just going to ask you the question. Can you give us a little teaser about what kind of new information you might be bringing out about Grover Cleveland that other books may not have? But you sort of partially answered that question just now. But is there anything else that you can sort of throw out there as a little teaser for us?
Sure. I think there's really two things. And you know, there are some new things by dint of the research, although, you know, I'm deeply obligated. I stand on the shoulders of a lot of people who have done good work about Cleveland in the past. I think the two contrasts probably with this book and the other ones that have been written in the past are one, that focus on policy and the issues that really faced him in both terms, because there's this odd notion, and it's not limited to Cleveland, it's true of a lot of presidents of that era, that nothing really happened. Americans are sort of weirdly unfamiliar with the Gilded Age. We know more about the Civil War and the American Revolution, things that happened further back in history. Just because I think so many of the issues of that era are not familiar to it. They don't have analogs in modern life. So just to give you one example, I mean, during Cleveland's second term, he deals with what is probably the worst economic depression that the country has ever had up until that point. But it's a hard policy scenario to explain to modern Americans because his interaction with it is nothing like an interaction that a president would have with an economic crisis today because there's no Federal Reserve. So he's essentially trying to manage monetary policy. So anyway, there's a lot of policy things like that. The other thing that is new is, as I say, people have written a fair bit about Cleveland in personality terms and his personal life. And one of the developments that I think has been negative is that over the past decade or so, there has been a really focused interest in his romantic life, both his marriage to Frances Cleveland and also the allegations around the 1884 campaign and him potentially having had a child out of wedlock.
Right.
Both of which are totally legitimate, you know, areas of investigation. And they're, I mean, look, my purpose in writing this book has not been to write a hagiography. I mean, there's a lot I like about Grover Cleveland. I think it's hard to write a biography of somebody you don't like, but I've always wanted to hew towards the truth and try and figure out as much as I could. And in investigating both of these things, what I have found is that there are things that are weird and sort of interesting about them, but in the past decade or so, there's been a real attempt to turn Cleveland into sort of a grotesque on both fronts, including a book that was written that accused him of being a rapist.
Oh,
I shouldn't laugh at that, but it's just, and in some of the research for this book, I've found that the people who have come to the really extreme conclusions have either made serious mistakes in their research, have overlooked pretty obvious details, or looking to slander him. And as I said, the point of my book is not to rehabilitate him necessarily, but it's just to give a clearer, more accurate depiction of what happened. And so these things have been sources of controversy for the last 10 years or so. And I think people reading my book will come away with a slightly more balanced version of it. Doesn't mean necessarily that you'll think Grover Cleveland comes out of either of these situations as a hero, but he doesn't really come out of them as a devil either.
It's good just to know that you've written this with so much research and a passion for bringing out a balance of information about this man, the 22nd and 24th president of the United States, and being a trustee at the Grover Cleveland Birthplace Memorial Association. I am thrilled that this book is coming out. Would you be willing to come back as it gets closer to the release date of your book and have a more in-depth conversation about Grover Cleveland and some more of the interesting things you've uncovered in your research?
Oh, absolutely, James. I'd be delighted to come back.
Well, thank you so much, Troy. Thank you for this little sneak peek preview of your book, A Man of Iron, The Turbulent Life and Improbable Presidency of Grover Cleveland. We're really looking forward to reading it.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, Troy. Thanks again.
I appreciate it. Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Your History, Your Story. You can connect with us on Facebook and YouTube at Your History, Your Story, or on Instagram and Twitter at YHYS Podcast. We'd love to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, or a story to tell. Be well and God bless.